Public servants, thought leaders, and experts from across Canada are reflecting on the ideas shaping public service, leadership, policy, governance, innovation, and beyond. This is the Review and Reflection series, produced by the Canada School of Public Service.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us today at the Canada School of Public Service. Today, as always, we have a treat for you. And our treat is somebody you may not be familiar with, but he's here because he's a Canadian with a remarkably interesting basket of skills and experiences and capabilities that in many ways speak to us as Canadians. And also, one of the ways that speaks to us as Canadians, he's a Canadian that goes back and forth between Canada and the U.S. a lot. So we are here today with Professor Barry Appleton, who is a law professor at New York University. He's a Canadian, and he's a few other things that we're going to talk about over the next little while. So Barry, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Barry, tell us a little bit about yourself. Let's start off. Where were you born?
I was born in Philadelphia.
Oh, wait a second. I just introduced you as a Canadian.
I am a Canadian. My father, both my parents were Canadians. And like many Canadians, they went away to do some graduate education. My father was a doctor, was doing postgraduate medical work at the University of Pennsylvania, where I just happened to be born. And then we moved back. But it was interesting because being born in the United States meant that I could sort of start my sojourning back and forth across the border, and what later would become a career in trying to understand Americans for Canadians and Canadians for Americans. I was sort of born into it.
Wow. So you're like, I'll call you a Nexus child, a Nexus baby. So you said your parents went back after you were born. Where was back?
Toronto.
Toronto. Tell us a little bit about Toronto when you were growing up. Was it a fun place? Was it a scary place? What kind of place was Toronto when you were growing up?
Toronto was wonderful, but unbelievably boring. It was a very boring, this is before we had a great influx of people from Montreal that made it interesting, from other parts of the world made it interesting. So when I was a really young kid in Toronto, it was still kind of stale and pale and as boring as it got, which is probably fine when you're very young, but very quickly you learn it's a lot more interesting to have the diversity and pluralism that makes Toronto great today.
So this is like the Toronto the good, the Toronto where kind of fun forgot. This is kind of maybe we'll call it like the blue Tory Toronto, the prim and proper.
This is the old Orange Order. This is the Toronto where everybody wanted to go either to Montreal, where it was really interesting, or if it was you really want to do something, you could go to Buffalo. Think about that.
Well, I'm a Torontonian, so I remember every year we would go to Buffalo to buy our winter clothes for the next school year coming up.
We got to work on that one.
Yeah. So, where'd you go to school?
So I went to a small private school where I did French immersion. Then by the time I was about 8, my parents said, "You don't know anybody in the neighborhood. That's no good." So I went to the local public school. And I went to high school as well in Toronto. And I really enjoyed the sense of communities. And I got very involved in local things, things with the Board of Education, things in the city, because Toronto is a city of neighborhoods and communities. And the more you could get involved in community, the more interesting and enriching life became.
It's fascinating. You kind of talk about kind of the old Toronto and the Toronto that we know today. And the Toronto that we know today is one of the world's most cosmopolitan, multicultural, multilingual societies. It wasn't like that when you were growing up.
It started, I started speaking French. My best friend when I was a young kid, his family had come from Italy. I learned Italian at a young age. So I got that multiculturalism and diversity, but not to the same extent that I would have today. But it was great. It was so interesting and it gave you opportunities. And the nice thing about it was, if you really wanted to engage, if you really wanted to do things, everything was open.
Yeah. You're one of the world's top international trade lawyers. You have particular expertise in our kind of Canada-U.S. agreements. That means, and you're also a law professor at New York University. So that means, I assume, you have a law degree, you went to law school, you went to university. Tell us a little bit about that period, and tell us a little bit about what drew you to law school, why you kind of ended up focusing on international trade. Tell us a little bit about that part of your story.
Well, I went to the University of Toronto first, and studied actually to be a diplomat. So I did international relations, and I was very fortunate that one of the great fathers, so to speak, of Canadian foreign policy, his name was John Holmes, and he took me in under his wing, and I learned a lot about the nature. He was very engaged at the time of Lester Pearson. I understood about the nature, the sort of the great period of Canadian foreign policy and Canadian engagement on a global basis. And so he really inspired me to be able to go and do things like that. Um, and then my mother took ill, and I had to take care of her when she was sick and raise my family. So I did that. And then I went off, my mother passed away. After that, I went off to law school. I went to Queen's. At that time, Queen's had the largest program in international law in the country. So I did some work on constitutional law. I'm interested about constitutional ordering, and I did work on international law. I took every course they possibly had. And then I had to make a decision. Did I want to go into the Foreign Service in Canada, or did I want to continue on with my legal education and do things from there? And so I spent a lot of time thinking about that. Um, and basically, I could make up my mind. So I did my articling in Toronto, which is, that you're required to do to become a lawyer. And then I went to Cambridge University. And at Cambridge, I studied international law, and I was very fortunate to be taken in as one of the last students of a very famous professor, Sir Derek Bowett. He was the expert on the international law of war and peace. And he was exceedingly generous with his time and his advice. And I really got to understand the nature of international law in a very different way than I ever experienced in Canada.
So we'll come back to your international law experience and your trade experience in a moment. But before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about some of the stops you had along the way. So I'm going to mention a name or an agreement or something, and just kind of tell us a little bit about your involvement or your relationship. So the first is not Justin Trudeau, but Pierre Elliott Trudeau.
Well, when I was still in Toronto, I had the opportunity to work with, the time he was the Secretary of State. His name was John Roberts. And John had a profound influence on me. Um, and that was the 1979 election where he lost. But I ran an event with him and Pierre Trudeau. I couldn't drive yet, but I was able to do a big event. And so all of a sudden in 1980, Pierre Trudeau is back, and I had the opportunity to work with Mr. Trudeau and a number of people on this team, and I learned so much about the nature of governance and public policy. And because I was interested in foreign policy, and he was getting quite interested in foreign policy at that time too, I had some real opportunities. Plus, everyone was very nice to me because I was a young kid. So it was a real interesting introduction to a very different world from people who knew a lot.
Keith Davey.
So Senator Davey was basically, we'll sort of call him my political godfather. Would sort of check in on me every week with his wife, Dorothy. They became family. I had to get approval from them before I would date anybody. It was pretty interesting. But I learned a lot about the politics of joy. That public policy wasn't just about being able to engage just in good policy, but you could do so in a way that was engaging and that would resonate about sovereignty, for example, but still you could enjoy yourself, and he knew how to have fun.
John Turner.
Um, So John Turner, he ran uh, after he had been out of government for a long time, and I had the opportunity to run what was called his policy analysis group and help brief him on new policies. It was really interesting because he had been the president of the WTO when he was our finance minister. He knew everybody. I did calls would come to the office from all over the world. U.S. Secretary of State would call. I mean, but he hadn't been engaged in day-to-day politics and day-to-day policy. So I had to really get myself up to speed on policy and then sit down and understand how to brief somebody who at the time he was the leading candidate and later became the prime minister. And that was a challenge, learning how to be able to deal with that. So I got better at being able to deal with different audiences and different approaches. But there was still a learning experience. But he was a very thoughtful person.
Yeah, and for those of us who remember kind of the Chrétien-Martin dynamic and kind of the prime minister in waiting, Martin, we also had that with, I think, with Mr. Trudeau the first and Mr. Turner. It was kind of like the prime minister in waiting. Did you have that sense that here you were working with somebody that, was probably going to be the next prime minister of Canada?
I thought so, but you didn't know for sure. But at the end of the day, um, it was more about the opportunity to engage in public policy. I think I got that bug early, and I think that was what was so appealing, and it gave me an insight because it isn't that you had the power to make the decision. It's what would be the right decision, and how do you think about it, not just for now, but going forward. And a lot of these people were thinking long term. We don't do that so much anymore, but long term ideas were more important at another age.
Meech and Charlottetown, do you want to do them together? Do you want to talk about one of them and not the other?
They're different. So during Meech Lake, I was at law school, and I had the opportunity to work with John D. White, and he had been very involved in the patriation of the Constitution. He worked with Roy Roman,
Constitutional scholar.
constitutional scholar, but he had been the former Deputy Attorney General of Saskatchewan and later became Deputy Attorney General again. But he was part of that process. And so when Meech occurred, I had the opportunity to think a lot about the nature of Meech Lake and the impact on minority rights. And I spent a lot of time working on that, discussing with that. I had the opportunity to talk with Mr. Trudeau somewhat about it and other people, some of which who later went to the Supreme Court and other people that later went into very powerful positions in government, to understand the complexity and the nature of Canadian society, and the interrelationship between multiculturalism and Quebec, another very significant issue. So Meech was interesting. Charlottetown, I had the opportunity to work for the government of Ontario in those negotiations. I spent maybe 19 months, and I became the rapporteur for the provinces in the division of powers. Division of powers is that section of federalism about who gets what powers.
91 and 92, the
Yeah,
core
well,
of our Constitution.
A couple more that go in there too. And the early discussions about interprovincial trade were in there too. And so I spent a lot of time in very, very extensive negotiations. I think I learned a lot about listening. I think that this was the first time that we had the First Nations groups as part of this process. Quebec would not participate at that time, so we had issues to try to deal with that. It was complicated. It had many different values, the appreciation and the thought that public policy had to do more than just get us to a solution for today. We had to have something that would work on an ongoing basis. At the end of the day, that agreement didn't make that test, and it was rejected.
It was rejected, though, like Meech was rejected in very different ways. Meech was, what we call in the business a function of executive federalism, where the premiers and the prime minister kind of got together and said, oh, we've changed the Constitution. And then I think maybe as an afterthought, people remembered, oh, yeah, the 1982 patriation meant we now had an amending formula. It meant that it had to go through legislatures. Charlottetown was very different. Charlottetown, if Meach was kind of a little bit, let's call it secretive, a little top down, so to speak, Charlottetown, my God, it was about as participatory as you got in Canada.
It was the most participatory we ever had. And one of the reasons why I failed, because people weren't ready for transparency, for having the windows open, for having the full impact. And that was actually good for democracy, but bad for that process.
Yeah, and in fact, it was where a legislature or two, depending on how you count, rejected Meach or didn't vote on Meach. In Charlottetown, it was actually the Canadian population that said no, which was, I guess, the ultimate demonstration of how far we've come in terms of the sovereignty of Canadians thinking into this. Now, we're not gonna get whiplash, but we're gonna fast forward, oh gosh, 3 decades. And I just mentioned the word sovereignty. And now we're at a period where a different set of political actors are using the word sovereignty because, again, it matters. But this time it's kind of outside of the constitutional realm. It is vis-a-vis a whole different set of issues. So I'm going to ask you a little bit about some of those modern issues of sovereignty. The first is data. What is data sovereignty?
Data sovereignty is foundationally the concept that either you can control the data that's around you or you're controlled by it. It's that foundational choice. So it's a governmental idea. Does the government get to control the nature? Does it get to regulate it? Can it require that it be made transparent? Can it impact on whether the computer systems give you answers in certain ways, which might be important for election interference or for personal rights or for the protection against predation? That's data sovereignty. And so it sounds complicated, but really it's not that complicated. It's either you control or you're controlled.
And is that the same with kind of sovereignty and compute? We're hearing a lot of that right now in Canada, that we need sovereign compute. What is that? Why is that important?
Well, sovereign compute's different because data sovereignty is about the cloud, it's about all types of things in general. Sovereign compute is the ability of the government to ensure that certain core foundational things, your health data, your tax data, your national defense information, your border information, is kept entirely in sort of encrypted Canadian hands so that Canadian courts can review it, so Canadian authorities can decide how that works. And the reason that becomes important is that if you give part of that outside of Canada, you may find that Canadian courts lose jurisdiction to be able to deal with it. Or the flip side, you may find that Canadians and this very private data is surveilled by outsiders. And that can be very problematic. So it's about keeping the ability of government, the capacity of government to be able to do its job, which is to govern. It loses that if it doesn't have that. So if you don't regulate, you become the governed.
So while we're talking quite a bit about sovereignty in the last year or two in Canada, I think it's fair to say that the last time before this current period that we talked a lot about sovereignty was actually when we started negotiating one of kind of the big three trade agreements that we have with our American cousins, neighbors. We have three trade agreements, or we negotiated kind of in succession three trade agreements. I want you to talk to us a little bit about each. Let's start with the free trade agreement, the original free trade agreement with your old, I don't know if he was your boss, but Mr. Turner said it was the fight of his life to make sure that that trade agreement did not pass. Talk to us a little bit about the original free trade agreement.
Well, the first trade agreement was a real question about whether or not Canada would be prepared to enter into a relationship that could be dependent. See, the concern about the first free trade agreement was that it might be that Canada might become over dependent on the US markets. And that would mean that we would lose our capacity and our ability to be able to sell to other parts of the world or to ourselves. In other words, it was so easy to sell to the Americans. They were so close. And our dollar was a little bit lower, though at some points at that time, our dollar was actually higher than it is right now. So the idea was somehow we would lose something if we were to go there. And in fact, the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, when it came through, became very successful. We probably didn't lose too much of our sovereignty, but we lost a lot of our edge. We lost of our innovation because we no longer had to innovate to get markets because it was just so easy. It was just proximity. That basically gave us, and later on we're going to pay the price for that, but at the time it worked out much better than maybe we had thought.
So maybe I'm going to put words in your mouth, and if they're the wrong words, take them right out of your mouth and tell me, no, no, they're the wrong words. But it didn't cost us our sovereignty. But if I'm hearing you correctly, it might have cost us a little bit of complacency.
Cost us a lot of complacency.
Second agreement, North American Free Trade Agreement. We liked the first agreement so much, we went back for more, and we brought in a new dance partner too.
Well, first of all, in the NAFTA, we didn't bring the dance partner. We were the new dance partner. The Americans were doing a deal with the Mexicans, and we weren't involved. We actually went to the Americans and said, hey, let us in. They were already advanced, and we came into an existing set of arrangements. At the end of the day, enhancing protection on investment, enhancing the scope of the original agreement made a lot of sense for Canadians, because Canadians were investing in the United States, but we didn't have protections. Canadians were engaged in cross-border services. We didn't have any of those provisions that were in the original agreement. So it was a natural second step after having experience for a number of years for the first.
So the first trade agreement, a lot of kind of angst one way or the other. Second trade agreement, I think it's fair to say, a lot less angst. It was kind of like, yeah, this is just kind of like a natural progression. After all, we live in a globalized world. Capital flies around the world. Goods fly around the world. This is natural. The third trade agreement, which ironically has two names depending on where you are uttering the name. We're in Canada, so let's call it CUSMA. Talk to us about that trade agreement.
Well, CUSMA, or ASEAN French, of course, it has...
Actually, it has three names.
It actually
Forgive
has four,
me.
because the Mexicans
yeah.
have a name for it too that's
Yeah.
totally different.
Yeah.
You know, it's the most amazing agreement because everybody has a name for it, and basically everybody hated it while it was in operation, but now they all love it because they don't want it to go down, except perhaps the Americans. We don't really know. Okay, so the CUSMA, what it is, Canada had the opportunity of having all types of open access to the U.S. market from the NAFTA. Didn't want to lose that. President Trump comes in, wants to renegotiate. There's a risk of losing the access. The access was key for Canadian business because almost 3/4 of our trade, a little bit more, it goes to the United States. And so we wanted to protect that access and not have to pay for it. So CUSMA, as it is, gave us that access. There were some difficult negotiations. We had to give up some stuff. So from NAFTA, we're going downwards a little bit to the CUSMA agreement, but we still had the opportunity to get access to the market, and that was critical for Canada. And so we sort of put some water in our wine, and that's where we were at.
Now, you mentioned President Trump. President Trump comes in 2016 originally and starts saying, I'm not sure this is a good deal for us. What's going on?
Well, later he said it was the best deal ever. So he must have improved it. That's all I can say. Okay, because it was his deal. All right, so look, we got the deal. The Canadian public policymakers aren't particularly happy. It's tricky to get that deal because there's a transition of government going on in Mexico. That transition's going on. We had to fit it in to their transition. We weren't happy with the terms. The Americans weren't happy that we were slow. It left a lot of very unhappy feelings that we thought would be fine in Canada until Trump comes back later. So for that time, it was something we could live with, but it was less than we had, not more. That's the story.
And now we're sitting here in late 2025 for those of you that are going to watch this later to make sure that we're situated properly in time. And not only is Kuzma back at issue, but it is also potentially not just about renegotiating, but we're hearing things out of the president's orbit about maybe we won't have a trade agreement with Canada.
Look, what I think you're seeing is that CUSMA, as a trilateral agreement, is basically lived its life. It's going to be over. The Americans don't want another trilateral. They want bilaterals. They have more leverage. They want one with Mexico and one with Canada. So whether you want to call the new one with Canada CUSMA 2, which I hope we don't, or you want to call it something else, which I hope we do, there's going to be something else happening. Now, let's really focus in, though. Is that good for Canada or is it bad for Canada? And the answer is it doesn't make a difference. Why? Because the existing agreement is no longer worth the paper it's written on, because it's not being followed. Partly the administration in the United States is following part of it right now with respect to what they call CUSMA compliant goods, but with these massive Section 232, these massive sectoral tariffs on autos, on steel, on aluminum, on copper, on lumber, it's totally usurping the playing field. And that requires something new. And the problem is for Canada that we've become so reliant since going through that process, from going right back to that first trade agreement, we've become so reliant on the United States. And we didn't innovate, we didn't become more productive, we didn't add those elements that we would really need to do to be able to sell around the world. So we're stuck selling to the Americans on the basis of low cost and proximity.
So, but wait a second. My understanding, I keep getting told by all the people in my orbit that Canada has the most trade agreements in the world. That there isn't another country that has negotiated as many trade agreements as we have. But you're saying we're still as reliant on the United States as ever. Am I hearing you correctly?
When 3/4 of your business is with one client, you are in a very vulnerable spot, and they know that. And of course, the other part about that is that the terms of the CUSMA are different from other treaties in that it had a limited term across the board, and it had a 6-month clause. That means that it could be gone in 6 months unless it was renegotiated. So whether Canada renegotiates it on its own or whether it's forced into a renegotiation, there's going to be a profound realignment. And that fits into the concept of the end of neoliberalism, the end of having that concept where all those trade agreements are good. Canada hit the apotheosis of having the most number of trade agreements at a time when that was an important figure, an important standard. But now we're in a different time. And maybe it doesn't mean as much as it did before. So instead, we want the ability to trade all over, but you got to have products, you got to have innovation, you got to have the things that people want to buy.
Now, in addition to advising governments, and you do fairly regular testimony in the United States representing Canada as a Canadian, not as part of the Canadian government mostly. You also you have a lot of private sector clients. And tell us a little bit about some of the things that they worry about. I imagine they worry about things like regulations. I imagine they worry about things like intellectual property. I imagine they worry a little bit about investment flows, not just trade flows, where your capital stock is going to go. Tell us a little bit about, maybe if I can put the whole burden of the private sector on your shoulders, how some private sector corporations, be they American or Canadian, think about these things.
The most important thing for the private sector is predictability. That's what they want more than anything. They'll adjust to anything, but they want to know that it's predictable. The second thing they want is the rule of law and due process. They go together. So predictability and the rule of law, you put that together, it's good for business, it's good for government, it's good across the board. Right now, they don't have that. So right now, they don't know what to do. And most of the time, when they don't know what to do, they're not making any investment. So I'm seeing no new inbound investment in Canada. It's frozen since these issues with the Americans have started. Maybe that will get fixed if there's a new agreement. Until that time, I don't see a lot of opportunity there. And they have a choice. They can invest in the United States, have access to the whole market, or they can invest in Canada and maybe have access or maybe not. Where would you put your money? It's not like in AI and in data and all those areas, tremendous amount of investment going on in the US, almost no investment in Canada.
Billions upon billions upon billions of dollars um, in AI, in compute, in data centers, etc. Do you have a prediction about how this part will play out before we move into the next part of our discussion?
Sure.
And remember, Yogi Berra said that making predictions was really, really difficult, especially if those predictions were about the future.
Thank you. So let's put it this way. I don't worry about what I read in the newspaper. As Senator Davey used to say to me, today's newspaper wraps tomorrow's fish. Of course, that was at a time when we still had newspapers. We still have fish, we just don't have the newspapers. At the end of the day, I think on a longer term basis, I think what we're going to see is a new arrangement with the United States. And that arrangement is not going to be particularly beneficial to Canada. I think Canada is going to have to pay for access to market. I think we're going to have something very much like what the EU has, but maybe even at a higher rate, so 15% or 20% across the board. And so that may stop the pain on some of those sectorals, but foundationally, some of those businesses, the older businesses, are gone. My focus and my concern is that the new economy isn't wrecked. That's got to be important for us because our futures are in a new economy, not just in the old. So higher value added with things we have. Critical minerals are a really good example of that. Refining and being able to deal with that rather than just ripping it out of the ground and shipping it out as low as possible. But then the flip side is, how are we going to regulate? How are we going to get jobs and focus with AI, with cloud, with data? That is the future. That's the next generation. That's what I'm worried about. That's what I'm hoping we can get resolved.
And I think I've heard you say something to the effect of, we have to stop focusing on nostalgia. Let's close this section on that. What do you mean by we have to stop focusing on nostalgia?
We were America's best friend, or so we thought. We had the situation of being in a loyal, trade monogamous relationship until we found out it wasn't. So we could sit there and grieve, but no matter how much marital therapy you can have in trade, it doesn't work unless both parties want to fix it and both parties don't. So the nostalgia is of a time when we were appreciated, or at least we thought we were appreciated, and everyone would follow the rules. Those times are over. We got to get our head into a new game, or else we're going to be in real trouble.
So now we're going to turn from kind of hardcore realpolitik. We're going to turn, I think the audience gets a sense of kind of your energy and your love for this topic. You have energy and love for another Canadian topic, which is one of the reasons why you're here, which is Canadian art. Tell us a little bit about your relationship with Canadian art, and then we'll unpack each of those different segments.
So while I was at the University of Toronto, I had friends, and they had probably what I'll call a trading post. It was a store in Toronto. It had furs. It had Aboriginal art.
Was it the Hudson's Bay Company?
No, it was not the Hudson. That's now a former company too. No, it was on Yonge Street near Bloor, but it wasn't the Bay. And you'd go there and be able to hear stories about what things were like. I would go there, and they had some really interesting First Nations art, in particular Inuit art. And so I would save up, and I was able to finally buy something. I was about 20 years old, and I bought a piece of Inuit art by Uvulu Tanili, who I later got to know as an artist and a person, but I didn't know any of these things. And that got me started on a real passion. Not only Aboriginal art at the beginning, I did Canadian female artists as well, but that really started me as saying, you know what, you can you can actually buy something, you can actually do something and have a sense of it. So I'm not creative personally, but I was able to step in some way and feel part of the country, part of our heritage in another palpable way. And I just enjoyed it so much that started that.
Now, I think you are the largest collector of Inuit art in kind of in private hands, is that?
Apparently that seems to be the case. Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that collection.
Okay. Well, so I was because of my interest actually in Canadian female artists, I got involved with the Art Gallery of Ontario. They thought that was interesting, and then they found out I had other interests as well, and I later became the chair of the Canadian Curatorial Committee, the committee for the Art Gallery of Ontario, in charge of getting new art for its collection or getting rid of art, de-accessing it. I spent years involved with that. While that was going on, I spent more and more time working with artists from around the country, getting to know more of their stories and meeting more and more Indigenous artists, especially Inuit artists. So I started going to Nunavut. I started acquiring more and more works, loaning works out and working with universities and art galleries across Canada and later in other institutions around the world to build the capacity for curators to be able to deal with this, to build a cadre of Inuit curators to be able to talk about their own art. I later became the chair of the Inuit Art Foundation and the publisher of their magazine, the Inuit Art Quarterly. So no good deed goes unpunished. Uh,
So you fell in love with maybe the prototypical Canadian art as it's known around the world, Inuit art. Tell us a little bit. Is it masks? Is it sculptures? Is it paintings? Is it drawings? Do any of those particularly draw you?
So I have very significant holdings both of prints and drawings, of other graphics. So for example, there'll be stone cuts because be like a wood cut, but they don't have wood because you're in the Arctic, so you do it against stone, um, and also of sculpture. And over the years, I was sort of taken in by some of the wonderful artists, some of the great names, Canada-U.S, for example, and Kananganak Pudugu were both very, very thoughtful and kind. They're both elders, and they gave me my name, and Inuktitut Atjiargaluk Chuk was my name, which sort of means Swiss Army knife. It means something very handy to use if you're stuck on the road. And Inuit life is about innovation and being nimble, something that we could learn in public policy. So having a really handy little tool along the way, probably pretty good. So they said that was a good name. I'll still take that as a good name. But I had the chance to meet and work with artists from all parts of the Inuit Nunangat, and that was really deeply rewarding, and my time with elders and communities along the way too. So yes, we built a fabulous collection. More importantly, we're able to share that material in museums around the country and to be able to work on programs of scholarship too.
What did they teach you about Canada, about being a Canadian? Clearly, your eyes lit up when you were talking about that.
First thing it taught me is don't give up. No matter how tough it is, that if you give up, you might not make it. So you have to keep going. So I would hear stories that things were really tough, but these are survivors. Canadians can be unbelievably innovative and they can be unbelievably tough. We don't give ourselves enough credit. We sit back and we talk about how we can't do things. These are people who lived or died because they did or did not do. They taught me it was important to do and to do it with purpose. And so I try to keep that mission alive and I try to deal with it with my public policy work.
Now you have, as we've talked about a little bit, you have one foot on one side of the 49th parallel, so to speak, and another foot on the other side of the 49th parallel. What do you wish that more Canadians knew about America, and what do you wish that more Americans knew about Canada?
Nobody's ever asked me that question. It's a really good one. Um, Foundationally, um, I wish more Canadians would recognize that even if Americans are going to be in a tough negotiation, it's not because they hate you. It's because the nature of the market. It's just so it's the way they're wired. They don't hate you because they want a good bargain, but they want the best bargain, and there's usually only one best bargain. And for Canadians, to our American friends, um, I want them to know that even though we're polite and we clean up after ourselves, at the end of the day, we're pretty tough too. And so being polite doesn't mean that Canadians are pushovers, and it doesn't mean that Canadians want to be Americans. So the fact of the matter that we might like Americans and we might work with Americans doesn't mean that we naturally want to be Americans. And it's sometimes difficult because sometimes Americans think everybody want to be Americans. And so it's a bit of a lesson I have to sort of deal with.
We are neighbors on a continent. I think it's fair to say this is a moment for the Canada-U.S. relationship. I wanna, because you're a legal scholar, I wanna close us off on the following note. It's a little philosophical, but I'm pretty sure based on our conversation you can handle this. The American Constitution speaks about life, or sorry, no, the U.S. Declaration of Independence speaks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the Canadian Constitution, if it has a philosophical twist, it would be in the phrase peace, order, and good government. Does that accurately capture something important about the people who live north of this line or south of this line?
At a time it did. I don't think it does anymore. I think the world has changed. I think the ubiquity of the internet and global culture has affected in some foundational ways. When I go to Nunavut and people have their phones and they can see what's going on, it no longer had that sense of what we had before. So at one point when I started my career, peace, order, and good government would be the way, right? That would be our Canadian approach. I think we have a little bit more pursuit of happiness and a little bit more liberty that can be in there. And when Canadians finally feel that liberty interest is abridged, they finally were getting angry. And that's something else I saw for the first time in my life. So I don't think we're that different. I think that what we have is a sense of almost elision, of bringing this together in a way, but it doesn't mean that we're the same. It just means that maybe we share some common goals, and that might explain why our relationships have been so good until they weren't.
Professor Barry Appleton, thank you today for taking the time to come and talk to us a little bit about sovereignty, a little bit about Canada-U.S., a little bit about trade, a little bit about trade agreements, a little bit about art, and a little bit about what it means to be Canadian. Thank you so much, sir.
It's métissage. It's the element of being Canadian. Thank you.